they start rolling around, then the screaming starts, then they start having what seems like seizures. It's described that they like bent themselves in ways they thought people couldn't bend themselves. Very beyond anything that people had seen, and then it just keeps escalating. Then they say they see specters. All right, well, thank you for coming out today. It sounds like that's working, that you can hear me all right. Good, good. So I'm with you today to talk about the Salem witch trials, and specifically the life of Rebecca Nurse. Rebecca Nurse is one of the 19 people who will be hanged in the year 1692 under false accusations of witchcraft. With our topic, definitely gets a lot of play this time of year in October. Doesn't actually have anything to do with October, but of course that's just when people think of it and such, and that's when all the TV specials about the Salem witch trials happen to come back out of the closet just to be shown in October. Our talk about my research here is different than some other books on the witch hunt. When I first started writing this book, I do come from Danvers. It used to be Salem Village. I live right down the road from the Rebecca Nurse homestead. I have worked with different people at various museums in downtown Salem too, and don't envy them this month. Talking with my colleagues and such, right at the beginning, I often got the question of, oh, you're writing a book, awesome, why? Or how is it different than all of the other books about Salem? And it's true, there are so many books about the witch trials, especially the last like 20 years or so. There are some excellent ones that are real, academic analysis of a certain perspective, social class or the economy or religious change that kind of have one aspect. And in my reading of the witch trials, something was missing in a lot of these. There's an idea that these books try to cover the whole event. And it's not an event you can really do that and still remember that it's about people. The witch hunt lasts about 10 months, and during that time you have almost 200 people accused, 19 hanged, 1 pressed to death, and at least 5 die in jail. If you think of the 200 people accused, right away, that's like too many people for a book, like too many characters. Then you remember that each of them has people accusing them, each has people defending them. You have the people on the jury you have to toss in, you have the judges, and your book is going to be about hundreds of people. Like, that's unmanageable. And so when you read many of them, it often seems like the people just fall between the pages, that you don't really think of it as like a human story. And history is about people, like not statistics, like it should be about people. So I knew from the beginning that I wanted to write a biography of one person, and to kind of show how it's a real tragedy, how a person's affected, how their family's affected. And all right, I had about 200 people to pick from. And I picked Rebecca Nurse, not just because I live near her house, but she at the time was seen as basically the least likely person to be accused of witchcraft. She does not fit any of the molds you'd imagine, is statistically an outlier, not somebody you ever thought, based on other historians' research, would ever be accused. And so I thought by picking the least likely case, we could kind of learn more than if I had picked a different one. And so that's why I went with her. Our story of the witch hunt mostly takes place in Salem Village. This is a map from the late 1800s. And Salem Village is the black, kind of weird shaped area. To put it in perspective, this is downtown Salem, like the city of Salem today. Is the port, that's Beverly, and that's Peabody. So the village is separate from downtown Salem mostly. It's geographically separate. And so the village is basically Danvers. I'm not really artistic, especially when it comes to the computer, but I changed our borders here using Microsoft Paint, So this is Danvers today, the in-between. So you can see it really is the same. That's Middleton. Yes. So it's basically the same, other than we picked up the port, I guess. Nurse is going to live in the village on this farm, right in that house. But it's great that this has a laser pointer. That's excellent. Our real story in Nurse's life starts very far away from here. When Nurse is accused, she's living in Salem Village, but she's 71. Her generation is the generation that came over from England. So she's born in England, Great Yarmouth, comes over 1635 when she's 14. So she is old enough to, remember living in England. It's not someone who came over as a baby. And there's really very few people of that generation that are basically still around by 1692. So that is sort of like a unique experience also compared to others. And the reason that her family comes to Massachusetts is like so many others that came to Massachusetts. They were Puritans. And in England, they were being persecuted by the Church of England. They weren't allowed to practice their version of Protestantism. They had to follow the official version of the Anglican Church. And the reason, it really isn't just a religious problem. The reason they're so persecuted is when the king made himself, instead of being part of the Catholic Church, when the king made himself the head of the Church of England, if you disagree with him on religious matters, it's now a political problem. Like, you're not accepting his authority. So that's why they're really hassled. They come here to Massachusetts looking for a new sense of freedom in a way. They want to do their own thing. They're also not tolerant of other religious groups that want to come here. You have to be their group. So they don't really learn the real religious freedom lesson that you think you'd learn if you had been picked on. But the idea is that Massachusetts will be a place specifically for the Puritans. It's where they're going to succeed. They can finally have a stable place to do what they want to do. And a theme that kind of comes out throughout Nurse's life, or really in the whole life of Massachusetts, basically until the Revolution, is it never ends up becoming a nice, stable place for them to do what they want. Nurse, as like many settlers, faces all sorts of hazards, diseases, wars with the French, wars with the Native Americans, terrible weather, all of these things, internal conflicts. It could be political, it could be religious. That there never is that moment where everything seems settled and good. When she moves over with her parents, they live in North Salem, the Northfields here. She comes with her parents, Williamtown, Joannatown. Town is her maiden name before she becomes Rebecca Nurse. Her brothers and sisters, and she eventually marries a guy, Francis Nurse. They live downtown on it's like a rented piece of land. We don't have a deed, so we know it's rented. Then they have 8 children. They move out here to the Western Farms in what would be the city of Peabody today. Again, renting land. And it's not until 1678, 14 years before the witch hunt, that they move to Salem Village. Up until that point, when they move here, up until 1678, not a lot different about her compared to everyone who came from England as a Puritan. It's fairly ordinary, not wildly different. She does kind of get notice in the church. She becomes a member of the Salem Church. Back then on a Sunday, all Puritans were expected to show up, but only about 10% got officially voted in as a full member of the church. And they only voted you in if they thought you were actually going to heaven, which is a high bar to try to pass. And they voted her in. So she's well respected in the church community. Other than that, she's just colonial mother, trying to raise her family and work on the farm. It's only here that we kind of start to, in 1678 with Salem Village, kind of have our story bending in a different direction. It's amazing how up until now we really don't have any issues, but we know what is coming is the worst event in colonial Massachusetts here. With Salem Village being a little separate community from the town of Salem, it had its own problems. And they move into a village that has a lot of disputes, a lot of arguments over a variety of topics, but primarily the church. Salem Village had wanted to 100% separate from downtown Salem and be its own town for decades. And downtown Salem refused to let them. They didn't want to lose all the real estate taxes of the whole village separating out. Step by step, the village gets more independence. First, they get their own militia. Then they get their own church and self-government. So this is the biggest step. So the church, on the one hand, is what makes them a community. And it's ironic that on the other hand, that's what makes them all not get along at the same time. Reverend Parris, the minister at the time of the witch hunt in 1692, he had only been there about 2.5 years by the time the witch hunt starts. When he's hired, it seems so hopeful. The previous 3 ministers had terrible relations in Salem Village for a whole variety of reasons. Some are personality conflicts, some are financial, political. The minister's salary is paid for by collecting taxes, and so therefore tax issues kind of intersect. Especially if you decided you did not like the minister, you might refuse to pay your taxes that year. The minister is therefore not getting his full salary. He can't make ends meet. All of these intersect. With Reverend Parris in 1689, when he's hired, the village puts together a hiring committee, basically. Town meeting picks a committee to negotiate. And it's fascinating how hopeful it seems. They pick people for this committee who had been on various sides of the previous disputes, so that we can kind of get a unanimous agreement, basically, all constituencies are involved. They pick him. We have no records of dissents over hiring Parris. In the background, we don't actually know that anybody else applied for the job. Salem Village had such a bad reputation, maybe Parris is the only candidate, and therefore they had to pick him. But when he comes, he's an outsider. He's from out of town. He had been really rich before. Father and uncle owned a plantation in Barbados. They sent him up here to go to Harvard, and then the money ran out. So he needs a job. This is his fallback career, is being a Puritan minister, which is to us a little unusual. So he negotiates fine with the village, but he negotiates hard. Spend a year trying to hire him. He keeps wanting more money. He saw himself as kind of being a higher social status, so it appears. Salem Village is a tiny farm community on the edge of the frontier. Not a lot of money. Really not a very established place that can afford to pay a nice salary to the minister. And what we see is the one sticking point as they try to negotiate with him revolves around the house where the minister lives. This is an area that in my research I had seen how in other books about the witch hunt it's kind of placed out of order. We have documents involving a dispute over this land that other historians had placed differently at different points. It's amazing how much documents how much paperwork we still have about the witch trials. We have more records of this than some events 100 years later. So we're fortunate in that regard. We have the church records in Reverend Parris's handwriting. We have all the town meeting records going back to 1672 when the village gets its own separate town meeting. And of course, records from the trials. Those are state records, the trial records. With Parris here, we see him trying to negotiate to own the parsonage, the minister's house, which is incredibly unusual. Every community in Massachusetts had to have a Puritan church, you had to have a minister, and they all provide a house for the minister. There was another historian who had researched specifically this issue, that out of it's 115 churches at the end of the 1600s in Massachusetts, all of them, the minister's house is public property, it's owned by the town. It's only single digits. It was either 5 or 6 where he owned his own house. That's weird. Reverend Parris wants to be given the deed to this house so he can be a landowner. Again, being a landowner kind of gave you a higher social status. And Salem Village they would want me to use the word thrifty. I would say cheap. They fight over everything. When they built the meeting house for the church to meet, they fought over exactly how many panes of glass that the taxpayers were going to buy, exactly how many window openings there would be, because they are very cheap. And so they're not going to give Reverend Paris this like public property that's owned by the taxpayers. They built the house. Reverend Paris isn't going to be minister forever. They're going to need a house for the next guy. So no, it's ridiculous that he would ask this, and he gets turned down. Fine, things go along well. 1689 is good. More people are joining the church. It seems stable. It seems nice. 1690, we have no real issues. 1691, everything's going fine. Right till we get to the end of 1691. The first weird stuff of the witch hunt will begin in January 1692, right at the beginning. We get into November of 1691, and things really start to go sideways in Salem Village. Reverend Paris blows all of the respected position and reputation that he had built up over these years on an issue involving this house. The village has a town meeting that fall, and they're going through the village record book, which lists every town meeting, every vote, has a signature of the clerk, like certifying that that was the vote and whatever. They find a record of a town meeting that nobody remembers. Well, it's an open town meeting. All the voters attend. Like, what do you mean not a single man in Salem Village remembers going to that town meeting? Like, this is not possible. It's not. And it was only a year before, allegedly. People have memories that last longer than 12 months. So it's strange. Weirder is it's not written correctly. It doesn't have the right signature. Something's weird. And allegedly at the town meeting, the only thing voted on was the village changed its mind and gave Reverend Paris the house. Well, you have a whole community that thinks they have been absolutely ripped off now, and it's Paris's fault. The record entry isn't actually in his handwriting, but obviously it's one of his friends. Because the moment it comes to light, Paris says, oh yeah, that happened. It's mine now. So he's in on it. We don't know who actually wrote it in the book, though. It had to be just a friend or an associate or someone. We do have a lot of documents in Paris's handwriting. We have like sermons still. His little sermon book has been published. So out of all the figures of the witch hunt, you can kind of seem to get to know him almost the most. With this, you can imagine they call another town meeting where everybody is absolutely livid and they vote to cancel his contract. You might think he's out of a job. Well, with the Puritans, nothing is ever easy. Nothing is straightforward. The village has decided they're never going to pay him again. They canceled his contract. But only the members of the church can fire him as a minister. So he has the job. He's just been told you're never going to get paid for it again. Most of you, all of us, if you were told your job wasn't going to pay you anymore, you'd probably find a new job, you'd imagine. He seems incredibly stubborn. And we see this after the witch hunt too. Unbelievably stubborn. He thinks if he can stick around a while, they'll take him back. He's going to stay. He also claims he owns the house, so he has no reason to leave. So he stays that winter of 1691 into 1692. He's not getting paid. In this household is him, his wife, several small children, only two factor into the witch hunt, 9-year-old Betty, 11-year-old Abigail, an adopted child. He has 2 enslaved people. We have Tituba and John Indian. And with no income, it means there's no food for all these people. There's no firewood to last through the winter. There's no other supplies you need to run a household. They really might not make it through this winter. It is a bad winter also. And it's in his house that is under all the stress, all this pressure that they might not survive here. He is begging people for wood because he can't supply his own. It's a real desperation. With all of this stress and pressure, this is where we start to see the first strange things happening. It's his daughter Betty and his niece, the adopted child, Abigail Williams, who start having strange happenings. Everybody who describes this, and in our documents, who's seen this firsthand, you can tell that they're like really struck by what they see from the way that they write. Like they can't believe that what they saw was real, but it apparently was real. At first, the two girls, they start like falling on the ground. They start rolling around. Then the screaming starts. Then they start having what seems like seizures. It's described that they like bent themselves in ways they thought people couldn't bend themselves. Very beyond anything that people had seen, and then it just keeps escalating. Then they say they see specters. It's like a ghostly, let's move in the microphone. It's like a ghostly image. First, it's like shapes, like animals, and then they start saying they see people. Nobody they know at first. And then they start saying that these specters they see are hurting them. That's why they're flailing. They're like trying to fight off this specter that someone has, that is hurting them. It keeps getting worse. At one point, Abigail Williams runs into a lit fireplace and tries to like climb up the chimney while she's standing in the flames. And two adults have to run over and yank her out of the fire before she like burns herself. Reverend Parris really tries to keep this quiet when this happens in his house. It's not in his interest for people to know this. If he's trying to get his job back, having the weirdest thing that anybody's ever heard of happen under your roof is not good for you. When you think of like a lot of television programs on the witch hunt, they always like to like blame Reverend Parris. A lot of TV programs I see are like he's doing it on purpose. Like he's somehow the mastermind or like the puppet master, and he's going to use this to like get back at his enemies or something like that. It's definitely not the case in any way. This is bad for him. This is not in any way going to help him. And he keeps it quiet for that reason. Reverend Parris he's not the evil mastermind here. He is also not a good guy, based on what we will see. And he does go on to testify against a lot of people. So definitely not a good guy in our story. What happens is he calls ministers to see these two children, and they tell him, like, relax. Don't do anything, and maybe it'll just go away as quickly as it came. They are confused. They can't figure it out, but don't do anything. And then it spreads. Teenage women, young women in their early 20s also, who also start having these fits. All of them had something in their past that would lead you to think some sort of like post-traumatic stress. Many of them were orphans. Some of them had witnessed their parents hacked to death in the wars with the Native Americans, things that would leave a psychological imprint on you. And at this point, everyone in Salem Village knows, like once it spreads, they call doctors, and it's a doctor who says it's witchcraft. You trust your doctor. It's multiple doctors, and they go through everything that they knew, and they find no medical explanation. They rule out, it's specifically noted that they ruled out epilepsy. It kind of looks like a seizure. You can see how they might, consider that. They would have known things you ate that could have caused weird things, and that's not believed to be what it was. And so what they're left with is it's not medical. Now, when they say it's witchcraft, it's taken up. This is the weirdest thing anybody's ever seen. They can't explain it any other way. The doctor is kind of educated and respected, and so he's believed. Then it transforms here to a criminal investigation. Rebecca Nurse is the 5th person accused. It's amazing somebody of such a good reputation is accused so early. The first 4 are people who do kind of fit more the stereotypical who's accused of witchcraft in colonial New England. Historians have done tons of statistics of these cases, like before Salem, in other places in New England, and they've put together, it sounds like a disease, but like risk factors that might lead you to be accused of witchcraft. The number 1 risk factor is being a woman in colonial New England. Prior to Salem, almost every single time it's a woman who's accused of witchcraft. It's not a man. Salem will be interesting in that there actually will be a ton of guys also accused. That makes it a little different than others. So the first 4 before Rebecca Nurse are all women. And in particular, it's people who had disputes, are outsiders, some sorts of conflict, or are maybe somebody's jealous of them. Those are reasons that could get you accused. The first accused is Tituba, the slave who lives in Reverend Parris's household. She was in the room where it all started. She's not English. She's not originally a Puritan. She's not from here. She's some sort of indigenous, probably to South America, is her background. But kind of the easiest target in Salem Village. And so when she's accused, it's believed that she's guilty. There's just an assumption of guilt. Next is Sarah Good, who's homeless, a beggar, says mean things to people, not really well liked. Apparently that's enough. Sarah Osborne is next. She hadn't gotten along with her family, had like some public fights with her family that was unseemly. She lived her husband, and a servant in their household. Husband dies, she then marries the servant really quickly, and people were kind of talking about like, was there something going on before her husband died? Scandal. And then there's Martha Corey from, what is today Peabody, who did not get along very well with people. All of them are arrested in Salem Village separately on different days, one at a time. They're taken to the tavern in Salem Village when they waited for 2 judges to come out from downtown Salem. Then when the judges arrive, then they would be John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin. Corwin's house is the Witch House in downtown Salem, the big tourist attraction. Then they're taken to the meeting house where they actually had a hearing before the judges. The original was torn down in 1700, so this is an exact copy at the Rebecca Nurse homestead. Again, we have a lot of paperwork. We have the exact descriptions. Because they fought over every window pane, we know exactly how many window panes and such. So they'd be standing down front, looking at 2 judges sitting at a table, and then whatever public would be in the pews behind them. And your first hearing is just a bail hearing. Are you going to be held in jail for trial or let out on bail? And they let nobody out on bail. But from the questions of the judges, it's so clear that these accusations are believed. John Hathorne does all the talking, it seems, from the records. And this is your opportunity to defend yourself for the first time publicly after you've been arrested. His first question, you think, would be, are you guilty? What do you think of these accusations? Do you have anything to say for yourself? Something like that. Instead, it's phrased kind of slightly differently each time, but it's always some form of the first question is, how long have you been a witch? He already thinks you are, and you're not going to change his mind. With this hearing, though, if you're the average Salem villager, you see the judges believing them to be guilty. In the audience are the afflicted having these fits, these seizure-like fits, saying, she's doing it to me, I'm being hurt by her. And if you were on the fence, after this, you're going to think it's real. There's no other way to explain these fits. With the way this develops in January, February, now we're into March when they're going to accuse Rebecca Nurse. These 4 people, like I said, unfortunately, they sort of fit a profile. It's amazing that they jumped to Rebecca Nurse next, really the least likely case. She's an important member of the church. Her only risk factor is that she is a woman, but she got along fine with her family. She obviously gets along fine with the church. No trouble with the government. No reason for financial envy or anything like that. There's nothing there. When she's accused, it's her husband who first hears that she's accused. He already starts planning a defense for her before she's even arrested. He had been in court before. The Puritans really like to sue one another for anything you can ever imagine. They also had real big beliefs in the importance of reputation. So tons of people get sued for slander or something. Things that we would think were kind of small and frivolous, and you'd never imagine taking someone to court for this. But he had been both sued and suing people, so he kind of knows the system. He immediately gets people to witness the moment when Rebecca Nurse is told that people have accused her. He gets respectable people to write down exactly how she reacts. She didn't hear it herself because she's homesick. Not only is she 71, but she's had some stomach thing. We kind of don't know any more than that. So she's sick in bed when her husband comes home with these important people and they lay this news on her. She quotes scripture. She says it's not her, that she knows absolutely nothing about witchcraft. She says, in a way, almost most importantly, that she's actually been really sympathetic towards these people having fits. She must have seen them before she was ill. And that she really thought something is affecting them or hurting them. She doesn't say whether she thinks it's witchcraft or not, but she really thinks they're suffering from something. something's going on. Within days, she'll be arrested, but she already has one sworn statement that'll be used at her trial. She arrested, taken to the tavern, then taken to the meeting house, and her hearing, I mean, knowing that her background is so different, you think that her hearing would be a radical departure from the previous ones, and it's not. There are moments where the judges kind of let up on their questions because she seems so convincingly innocent. You then have these fits from the accusers, and they kind of go right back to their hard-nosed, assuming guilt questions. And even she is sent to jail to await trial. After she has this appearance and before the judges and is presumed guilty by the judges, by seemingly the crowd that's there, obviously by the accusers, from after March, if someone of her reputation can be accused, anybody can be accused. And we really see the accusations go through all social status. Before it's over, they'll accuse and arrest the wealthiest guy in Massachusetts. They are going to go on to accuse and execute a minister for witchcraft. Because if you could believe a church member, one of the 10%, is a witch, well, what's stopping a minister from being a witch? So she's important in that sort of turning, making it broad. She'll be in jail, Salem, then they send her to Boston, back to Salem, and she'll go on trial in June. The governor's court that's established has sessions. It's judges from all over Massachusetts, so they all gather for a week, and then they go home for a while. And then they all gather for a week in Salem, and then go home for a while. First person tried is Bridget Bishop, who's not the first person accused, kind of weird, and it's just her at the first sitting of the court. Convicted, hanged outside Salem. Immediately this criticism, and one thing that I think other books have sort of overlooked is this idea of kind of right from the get-go, there's people thinking that what is going on is not correct. We have a lot of ministers after Bishop is killed who think you didn't really prove your case against her. The ministers obviously believe in witchcraft. That's kind of one of the most amazing parts of this is how can you get your head into the perspective of somebody who thought that this witchcraft was real. It's hard to try for us in the 21st, how can we even entertain that idea? How can we understand that they believed the devil might literally show up in your living room with a contract and say, I want to hire you to be a witch? How could you just think that this is how it's going on? So with Bishop, she is executed, but it's with criticism, there's hope. Maybe at the second sitting of the court, they'll take this critique in mind. We have one judge quit after Bishop's trial because he doesn't believe it was correct. Rebecca Nurse is in the second session, and they do nothing different, nothing at all. What we see is it's about half a dozen women on trial. It's about a week of their session in Salem. Sarah Good, one of the first accused, is also on trial that week. And with Nurse, she comes prepared with the best defense anybody has that whole year of 1692. Really has her husband and children to thank for it. You could, of course, present your own defense at trial, but if you're in a jail cell in Boston, how are you going to go collect paperwork? So you needed people on the outside. And you might think, okay, well, obviously they're going to stick up for their mother or wife or whichever relation. Don't assume that. There are a lot of families in 1692 who, when a family member is accused, kind of disappear on them and don't want to defend them. The reason is there are some, early on, some men who stick up for their wife who's accused of witchcraft and they're accused next. Why are you sticking up for someone that we believe to be a witch? So there's sort of this self-interest part. And some of the early ones, not only do families disappear, they kind of turn on their family members. Sarah Good's husband is asked to speak in her defense, and he has a pun on their last name. He says she's an enemy to all that is good. Well, that's not going to help her case. Martha Corey's husband, Giles, is asked at her initial hearing, and he says something to the effect of yeah, I've been suspicious of her for a while. Well, again, like, this is not helpful. It's not going to help your case. So they try to really distance themselves, unfortunately. So it is noteworthy that they stick with her. That's definitely not something you could assume. At her trial, the jury is going to come out wanting to find her not guilty, and the judges will intervene. And her eventual verdict is going to be the same as every other person tried in 1692, which is guilty. In the book, execution is in the title. We know, unfortunately, where this is going. Her family still doesn't give up, even now that she is convicted of witchcraft. They don't like the way that happened at her trial, the intervention of the judges, and they want to appeal, which apparently you could do. This is the only time it ever comes up in 1692, so people kind of have different views as to who you're going to appeal to. It's probably the Massachusetts legislature would have heard the case. Almost like an impeachment trial, like of the president. You would go, and the House of Representatives would be your jury in Boston. Weird. Well, that's kind of the English way to do it. The governor grants a reprieve. They're not going to execute her. So she has time to appeal. And then all we know is 2 Salem gentlemen, that's all we know, get to the governor, and the reprieve is taken away. And she's executed with the other women who were tried that week on July 19th of 1692. With Nurse's story, she has so many people in her defense, dozens, that now when she's executed, those dozens of people know this court isn't doing right by these people. And we see more and more outcry, people speaking out against it. We have more ministers speaking out against it, regular people still. Another half dozen men and women executed in August. Another half dozen men and women executed in September. And it's not till the fall that there's enough public opinion to basically make it politically untenable, and the governor has to stop it. So oftentimes people ask me how long until they realized it was wrong. It's like, well, they realized it was wrong first, and that's why they stop it. There are people for years later who will still claim that it was right, but the majority of people admit it was wrong. And kind of the last item I just wanted to touch on here is so many books about the witch hunt also just end there. What? Are we assuming they're all going to go back home and everything goes back to normal and you're going to go farm your fields next to the guy who accused your mother of witchcraft on the neighboring farm? How does this work? And it's amazing to try to see. We don't have enough records. People didn't keep diaries back then. You couldn't afford paper. So we don't have enough personal records, but we can see issues in the church. Again, they really want to get Reverend Parris out of there, which should not really come as a surprise. Families will have Rebecca Nurse's name cleared legally in 1711, about 20 years after the witch hunt. And we see her case stand out amongst all the others accused at Salem in that her family, generations, will continue to live on the Nurse farm. And in the 1880s, they put up a memorial to her. To us, this, again, from our perspective, it's good, of course. Of course you would do this to a person who was wronged in history. This is important in a way that is far beyond Salem. At the time, and in theory, this is a hard claim to prove, but they claim at the time, this is the first time any person accused of witchcraft in the entire Western world gets a memorial to them. All the people killed for witchcraft in Germany, nothing. France, nothing. Nobody ever has gotten a memorial with their name on it until Rebecca Nurse. It is worldwide news. People are reading about this in London and Paris and Australia. The idea that one of the Salem witches, as they put it, is being remembered. And it's money that they have fundraisers, just the family, family reunions of people across America coming out. People in Danvers donate money. The Globe has half the front page about the memorial. So if you look at the memorial there, my next slide is my photo of the memorial. It's not quite the same. It looks like they got the Bunker Hill Monument up there instead of Nurse's memorial, but whatever. That's from 2017. They had like a wreath and a service for the 325th anniversary. So that's why there's a wreath and flowers and such. Nurse is so far ahead. Again, she's remembered first. They're all innocent. Everybody who's killed in 1692 is wrong, but they pick her because her case was so compelling and so unlikely. That's why she's the first remembered. Historians in the 1800s, early 1900s, pick out her as an example of like how unjust this was. Again, they can't talk about everybody's case. So all 200. So they pick out her. We see in the 1950s, Arthur Miller in The Crucible, he writes an article in the New York Times after The Crucible is like, big hit. They ask him, like, describe your inspiration here. And he writes specifically that he went to the Superior Court in Salem, just going through these trial records back when they were kept there, and it was Rebecca Nurse's hearing, the question and answer transcript of her before the judges, that is what drew him to this story. And then he went out and he walked over to the Rebecca Nurse homestead and visited that, and like that's when he knew, like, this is the project, that it was her case that like jumps through. And out of the people in The Crucible, he kind of changes her the least. Like other characters, he changes ages, he changes families, or she's fairly true to like the actual person, pretty much. And it's not until 1992 that all of those who die in the witch hunt actually get a memorial to them. She is more than a century ahead of this. Through the 1900s, her farm is the only one that's saved as a museum out of all the homes of the victims of the witch hunt. Many, many, many of their homes still existed in 1900. Nobody did anything about it. There's still some that exist today that nobody has ever thought of like officially preserving in any way for people to visit or experience. It's just hers. And so that's kind of where I wanted to leave you. This idea that throughout all this event, we have all of these people that are wronged, but her case in particular kind of stands out at the forefront of all of them. So thank you so much for coming this afternoon. I'd be happy to take any questions you have, but I appreciate you guys being here. So thank you very much.